Elias blinked, his tear-filled eyes wide with confusion and disbelief. He looked from George to Vance, his mind struggling to process the monumental shift in power occurring right in front of him. "But Mr. Strait," he whispered, his voice trembling violently. "He fired me. I have to go. I need to figure out how I'm going to pay for the stone. I cannot cause any more trouble for you." "You are not causing me a lick of trouble," George replied, taking a step closer to the older man. "And you do not work for him today. Today you are working for me." George turned back to face Vance. The manager was practically hyperventilating, his mind racing through the catastrophic implications of offending a living legend in a store that relied entirely on the perception of Western authenticity. The regional directors would crucify him. The PR fallout alone could end his career in retail luxury. "Mr. Strait, please," Vance begged, his voice taking on a whining, desperate pitch. "You do not understand the situation. Elias has been underperforming for months. He brings down the morale of the entire floor. I have quotas to meet. I have corporate breathing down my neck. I cannot have an employee crying in front of the merchandise. It ruins the atmosphere." George took one slow, deliberate step toward Vance. The physical distance between them closed, and the sheer towering presence of the country icon forced Vance to take a stumbling step backward. "Let me explain something to you, son, and I suggest you listen closer than you have ever listened to anything in your life," George said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "This man just told me that he lost his only child. He told me that he was sitting in a freezing truck with a gun to his chest because the pain of that loss was so heavy it was crushing the life out of him. He is standing here in this soulless room, polishing your silver and taking your abuse, just so he can buy a piece of granite to put over his boy's grave. And your response to that kind of suffering, to that kind of unimaginable cross to bear, is to worry about your atmosphere." Vance opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of corporate defense, but the absolute disgust radiating from George paralyzed his vocal cords. "You look at him and you see a liability," George continued, his words cutting through the air like a finely sharpened blade. "You see an old man who does not fit into your shiny plastic vision of the world. But I look at him, and I see a survivor. I see a man who gets up every single morning, carrying a mountain of grief on his back, and still chooses to work an honest day. I see more dignity, more strength, and more real worth in the scuffs on his boots than in every single item of clothing hanging in this entire building." George paused, letting the silence ring out, letting the absolute truth of his words settle over the room. The two junior sales associates, who had been watching the scene unfold from the front register, were standing completely motionless, their eyes wide, absorbing the brutal, righteous dismantling of their tyrannical boss. "Now," George said, his voice returning to a calm, business-like register that somehow felt even more intimidating. "I came in here to buy a few things, and Elias here is the only man in this building I trust to sell them to me. So you are going to stand right there. You are going to keep your mouth shut, and you are going to let this man do his job. Because if you say one more disrespectful word to him, or if you try to stop this transaction, I promise you I will make one phone call, and I will ensure that everyone in this state knows exactly how the Silver Spur heritage treats grieving fathers. Do we understand each other?" Vance was trembling visibly now. The blood had completely abandoned his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. He nodded frantically, a sharp, jerky motion. "Yes, sir. Yes, absolutely. Whatever you want. Elias, please, assist Mr. Strait. Take all the time you need." George did not acknowledge Vance's submission. He simply turned his back on the manager, dismissing him entirely, and focused all his attention back on Elias. The older salesman was staring at George with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. The crushing weight of humiliation that had been pressing down on his shoulders just moments ago had been lifted, replaced by a surging, overwhelming sense of validation. He had been seen. His pain had been acknowledged. His dignity had been restored by a man who owed him nothing, but who understood everything. "Come on out from behind that counter, Elias," George said softly, offering a warm, encouraging smile. "I think I need a little more than just a buckle today. Show me what you have got." Elias took a deep, shuddering breath. He wiped the last of the tears from his weathered cheeks with the back of his sleeve. He reached down, picked up his leather employee vest from where he had dropped it on the floor, and put it back on, smoothing down the lapels with shaking hands. He stepped out from behind the glass display, his posture noticeably straighter, the stoop in his shoulders slightly less pronounced. "Yes, sir, Mr. Strait," Elias said, his voice finding a fraction of its normal strength. "It would be my honor." George clapped a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder, guiding him away from the jewelry counter and toward the center of the massive showroom. As they walked side by side, George deliberately matched his pace to Elias's slower, tired steps. They left Vance standing alone in the aisle, a ruined, sweating monument to his own arrogance. "Tell me about your boy," George said quietly as they walked past a row of expensive, hand-tooled leather vests. The question was not idle small talk. It was a deliberate, sacred invitation. George was offering Elias the one thing that grieving parents crave more than anything else in the world: the opportunity to speak their child's name, to confirm that they existed, that they mattered, and that they were remembered. Elias's breath hitched, but this time the tears that welled up in his eyes were not born of despair. They were tears of profound gratitude. "His name was Thomas," Elias began, his voice thick but steady. "Tommy, mostly. He was a good kid, strong as an ox, but he had his mother's heart. Gentle, you know. He loved the land. We had a small spread down near Uvalde before the droughts took it all. He used to ride this old sorrel mare we had, bareback, right through the brush. Never wore a helmet, never worried about the thorns, just loved the wind in his face." George nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, picturing the young man. "Sounds like a true cowboy." "He was," Elias smiled, a genuine, heartbreaking smile that illuminated the deep lines around his eyes. "When we lost the ranch, he did not complain. He just packed his bags and headed out to the oil fields. Said he was going to make enough money to buy the land back for us. He worked 80-hour weeks, Mr. Strait, covered in grease and mud, sleeping in a cramped trailer. But every Sunday, without fail, he would call his mama and me. He would play his guitar over the phone. He was not much of a singer, to be honest, but he sure loved trying." Elias paused, his hand reaching out to touch the sleeve of a suede jacket without really seeing it. The memory was so vivid, so painful, yet so incredibly precious. "He was saving up," Elias whispered, his voice dropping. "He had almost enough for a down payment on a little piece of property out by the river, and then the chain snapped. They said he did not suffer. They said it was instant, but that does not stop the nightmares. It does not stop the quiet in the house. When my wife passed a year later, her heart just gave out. The doctor called it a cardiac event, but I know the truth. She died of a broken heart, and I was left all alone in the quiet." George stopped walking. He turned to face Elias, his expression reflecting the deep, agonizing truth of the story. The silence between them was a bridge built of shared sorrow. "The quiet is the hardest part," George said, his voice barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of his own profound losses. "People think it is the anniversaries or the birthdays that break you, but it is not. It is the quiet moments. It is the sound of the front door not opening. It is the empty chair at the table. It is waking up in the morning and having to remember all over again that the world has fundamentally changed." Elias looked up, his eyes locking with George's. He saw the truth in the legend's eyes. He saw the reflection of his own shattered soul. "You know," Elias breathed. "You really know." "I know the road you are walking, Elias," George affirmed gently. "It is a long, dark road, and it never really ends. The weight of it never goes away. You just learn how to carry it a little differently as the years go by. But you have to keep walking. You have to keep carrying it because that weight is the love you still have for him. If you put it down, you leave him behind." Elias let out a long, trembling exhale, as if a massive, invisible band around his chest had suddenly snapped. The validation, the pure, unadulterated empathy from a man he admired so deeply, was a healing balm poured directly over his open wounds. For the first time in 3 years, Elias did not feel entirely alone in the dark. "Thank you," Elias whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you for saying that." George offered a small, sad smile, then gave Elias's shoulder another firm squeeze. "We honor them by surviving, brother. Now let's do some business." I have a feeling I am going to need a lot of gear today. George turned his attention to the expansive displays of the Silver Spur heritage. He began to walk with a renewed, deliberate energy, his eyes scanning the incredibly overpriced merchandise with a calculated, strategic gleam. Elias followed closely behind, pulling a leather-bound order pad and a gold-plated pen from his vest pocket. "Let's start over here," George said, walking toward the center pedestal where three magnificent, handcrafted Western saddles were displayed under focused spotlights. They were masterpieces of leatherwork, encrusted with sterling silver conchos, deeply tooled with floral patterns, and lined with the finest sheepskin. They were the kind of saddles that were meant to be displayed in a glass case in a mansion, not strapped to the back of a working quarter horse. "Tell me about these," George instructed, running a hand over the smooth, polished horn of the center saddle. Elias stepped up, slipping effortlessly back into his role, but this time with a sense of pride rather than fear. "Those are the Heritage Reserve Collection, Mr. Strait, hand-tooled by a master craftsman out of Santa Fe. The silver is solid, engraved by hand. The leather is imported, vegetable tanned, and oiled for 3 weeks. They retail for $12,000 apiece." George did not even blink at the astronomical price tag. "I will take all 3 of them," he said casually. Elias's pen froze over the order pad. He stared at George, his jaw dropping slightly. All 3, sir? That is $36,000. I have a few horses that could use some fancy jewelry," George replied with a completely straight face, though a faint twinkle of amusement danced in his eyes. "Write it down, Elias." Elias swallowed hard, his hand shaking slightly as he scribbled the item numbers onto the thick paper. He could feel the eyes of Vance burning into his back from across the room. The manager was still standing exactly where they had left him, watching the transaction with a mixture of absolute terror and greedy disbelief. George moved on, his boots clicking rhythmically against the marble. He stopped in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling display of exotic leather boots. There were rows upon rows of caiman, ostrich, python, and stingray boots, all polished to a blinding shine, each pair costing more than Elias made in 2 months. "These look comfortable," George noted, pulling a pair of full-quill ostrich boots from the shelf. "What is the inventory like on these?" Elias quickly checked the stock tags hanging behind the display. "We have a full run of sizes in the back, sir. Probably about 20 pairs in the full quill ostrich and another 15 in the caiman belly. They run about $1,500 a pair." "Box them all up," George commanded smoothly. "Every single pair you have in the back room. I have a big crew on the road with me. They work hard. They deserve some decent footwear." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He looked at the order pad, his mind struggling to calculate the sheer volume of the commission he was currently racking up. In the span of 5 minutes, George Strait had just authorized a purchase that exceeded the store's entire monthly sales goal. The commission on this single ticket would not only pay for his son's granite headstone, but it would pay off his truck, cover his rent for a year, and leave him with enough savings to finally breathe. "Mr. Strait," Elias stammered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper, "you do not have to do this. I know what you are doing. You do not have to spend this kind of money just to help me. I am fine. Really. You have already done more than enough just by talking to me." George stopped. He turned to Elias, his expression serious, stripping away the casual demeanor of a wealthy shopper. He looked deep into the older man's eyes, ensuring that his next words would anchor themselves permanently in Elias's soul. "Elias, I am not doing this out of pity," George said firmly. "I am doing this because I can. I have been blessed in this life beyond measure. I have been given a platform and a voice and resources that most folks can only dream of. And my daddy taught me a long time ago that when you are blessed, you do not build a higher fence. You build a longer table." George reached out and tapped the order pad in Elias's trembling hands. "You earned this. You earned it by surviving. You earned it by getting up every day and facing a world that took everything from you. You are going to take this commission. You are going to buy that boy the most beautiful piece of granite in the state of Texas. And you are going to stand tall when you put it in the ground. You hear me?" Elias could not speak. The lump in his throat was too massive, the overwhelming tide of gratitude too immense to put into words. He simply nodded, the tears flowing freely once again, dropping onto the leather-bound pad. "Good," George smiled gently. "Now, let's go look at those suede jackets. I think my guitar players need a wardrobe update. For the next 20 minutes, George Strait systematically dismantled the inventory of the Silver Spur heritage. He moved through the store with the precision of a general, selecting the most expensive, high-margin items on the floor. He bought stacks of hand-woven Navajo blankets, dozens of sterling silver belt buckles, racks of tailored Western shirts, and custom-made leather dusters. Throughout the entire process, Vance trailed behind them at a safe distance, hovering like a desperate, starving vulture. The manager was sweating profusely, his expensive cologne failing to mask the sour smell of his panic. He was watching a legendary commission being built right in front of his eyes, a sale that would guarantee his quarterly bonus and secure his position with the corporate directors. But he was completely powerless to intervene. Every time he tried to step forward, every time he opened his mouth to offer a sycophantic suggestion or try to take control of the transaction, George would simply turn his head, fix Vance with a cold, dead stare, and the manager would instantly retreat, shrinking back into the shadows. "Ring it up, Elias," George said, leaning casually against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. Elias stepped behind the register. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely type his employee identification number into the touchscreen. He began scanning the barcodes from the order pad, the machine emitting a rapid, continuous series of high-pitched beeps that sounded like a symphony of redemption in the quiet store. Vance could no longer contain himself. The sheer magnitude of the sale broke through his terror. He rushed up to the counter, positioning himself right next to the register, a greedy plastic smile plastered across his pale face. "Mr. Strait, this is absolutely incredible," Vance gushed, his voice trembling with forced excitement. "We cannot thank you enough for your patronage. This is a historic day for the Silver Spur heritage. I will personally oversee the packing and shipping of all these items. We will have them delivered to your ranch or your studio by tomorrow morning, completely free of charge." George slowly uncrossed his arms. He turned his head and looked at Vance. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The casual, friendly demeanor George had shared with Elias vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying, unyielding presence of a man who was about to deliver a fatal blow. "You are not going to oversee anything, son," George said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Vance's smile froze. He blinked, confusion warring with the rising panic in his chest. I do not understand, sir. I am the store manager. It is my responsibility to ensure—" "Your responsibility," George interrupted, his tone cutting through Vance's excuses like a scythe, "was to treat the people who work for you with basic human decency. A responsibility you failed at miserably." George reached into the back pocket of his Wrangler jeans and pulled out a sleek, heavy black credit card. He placed it deliberately on the glass counter, right next to the register. He did not hand it to Vance. He kept his hand resting over it. "Elias," George called out, not taking his eyes off the manager, "what is the total?" Elias swallowed hard, staring at the glowing green numbers on the screen. The final figure was staggering. "Sir, with the taxes, it comes to $84,620. Vance let out a small, strangled gasp. His eyes bulged as he stared at the screen. It was the biggest single transaction in the history of the franchise. His mind instantly began calculating his managerial cut, the praise he would receive from corporate, the absolute triumph of the day. "I'm going to pay this balance in full right now," George said slowly, his voice echoing in the silent store. "But I have a few conditions before I let you run this card." Vance nodded frantically, practically vibrating with greed. "Anything, Mr. Strait. Absolutely anything you want. Name it." George leaned in closer to Vance, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over the younger man. "Condition number 1, George stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unbreakable authority. "Every single penny of the commission from this $84,000 sale goes directly to Elias. Not a split, not a managerial percentage. The entire cut goes to the man who actually did the work and treated me with respect." Vance's face fell slightly, the greed battling with his corporate instincts, but he quickly nodded. "Yes, sir. Of course, Elias is the primary associate on the ticket. It is standard policy." "Condition number 2, George continued, his eyes narrowing, the intensity of his gaze pinning Vance to the floor. "You're going to reinstate Elias's employment immediately, with a raise, And if I ever hear, through the grapevine or otherwise, that he has been fired, disciplined, or treated with anything less than absolute respect in this building." George paused, letting the threat hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. "My lead attorney," George whispered, his voice dripping with icy promise, "plays golf every Sunday morning with the CEO of your parent company in Dallas. I will make one phone call, and I will personally ensure that you never manage so much as a lemonade stand in the state of Texas ever again. Do you understand the words coming out of my mouth, boy?" Vance stood absolutely paralyzed behind the polished oak counter of the Silver Spur Heritage. The blood had entirely abandoned his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent white under the harsh halogen glare. He looked like a man who had just been sentenced to a terrible fate and was entirely incapable of escaping it. The sheer overwhelming gravity of George Strait leaning over the glass, his voice a low, gravelly promise of absolute professional destruction, had shattered every ounce of the manager's corporate arrogance. The threat was not an empty boast. Vance knew, with a visceral, sickening certainty, that the man standing before him possessed the power, the wealth, and the influence to erase him from the retail industry with a single casual phone call. "I understand, Mr. Strait," Vance whispered, his voice trembling so violently that the words barely made it past his lips. His manicured hands gripped the edge of the counter as if the marble floor were suddenly tilting beneath his expensive leather shoes. "I swear to you, sir." Elias retains his position. He gets a substantial raise effective immediately, and the entire commission from this transaction, every single penny, goes directly into his next paycheck. "I will personally process the paperwork this afternoon. You have my absolute word." George did not immediately back away. He kept his piercing, unyielding gaze locked onto Vance's terrified eyes, letting the silence stretch out, forcing the younger man to sit in the suffocating discomfort of his own humiliation. The two junior sales associates at the end of the counter were holding their breath, witnessing the complete and utter dismantling of the tyrant who had made their daily lives a misery. "Your word does not mean a whole lot to me, son," George said slowly, his tone as cold and hard as iron. "But your fear does. And I expect you to remember this fear every single time you look at Elias. Every time you think about raising your voice or demanding respect you have not earned, I want you to remember exactly who is watching out for him. Now, run the card." Vance swallowed hard, a frantic nod jerking his head. "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." With shaking fingers, Vance reached out and took the heavy black credit card from beneath George's hand. He swiped it through the terminal. The machine processed the astronomical sum of $84,620 in a matter of seconds. The small screen flashed an approval message, and the receipt printer whirred to life. To Elias, standing just a few feet away, the rapid, mechanical clicking of that printer sounded like a choir of angels. It was the sound of his chains breaking. It was the sound of his son's legacy being secured. It was the sound of a miracle manifesting in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Vance tore the long, curling receipt from the machine and placed it on the glass counter along with a gold-plated pen. He slid the card respectfully back toward George, keeping his eyes downcast, completely stripped of his pride. "Sign here, please, Mr. Strait," Vance mumbled, his voice completely devoid of its usual sharp, commanding edge. George picked up the pen and signed his name with a smooth, practiced flourish. He then took the customer copy of the receipt, the long piece of paper that represented a life-altering sum of money, and turned away from the manager. He did not hand the receipt to Vance. He did not even acknowledge Vance's presence anymore. The manager had ceased to exist in George's world. George walked over to Elias. The older salesman was leaning against a display rack, his chest heaving, his weathered face buried in his calloused hands. The emotional whiplash of the past half hour had entirely drained him. He had been fired, humiliated, and pushed to the brink of despair, only to be resurrected, validated, and financially saved by the very man whose voice had kept him from pulling a trigger 3 years ago. It was too much for one heart to bear. "Elias," George said softly, his voice returning to that warm, comforting Texas drawl that had soothed millions of souls over the decades. Elias slowly lowered his hands. His eyes were red and swollen, tears tracking through the deep lines of his face, soaking into the collar of his faded plaid shirt. He looked at George, his expression a mixture of profound exhaustion and absolute, overwhelming gratitude. George held out the long receipt. "Here you go, partner. This is your ticket. You hold on to this. You make sure the numbers match up when your check comes in. And if they are off by even a single dime, you know exactly how to reach my people." Elias took the paper with trembling hands. He stared at the numbers printed at the bottom, the massive total, and the associate identification number that guaranteed the commission was his. The sheer reality of it hit him like a physical blow. The headstone was paid for. The debt was gone. The agonizing burden of failing his son in death had been completely lifted from his stooped shoulders. "I do not know how to repay you, Mr. Strait," Elias choked out, his voice breaking violently. "I do not have the words. You gave me my life back in that truck, and now you have given me my dignity back. You have given my boy his name in stone. I will work the rest of my life to pay this forward. I swear it to you." George reached out and placed both of his large, heavy hands on Elias's shoulders. The grip was firm, anchoring Elias to the present moment, transferring a quiet, unbreakable strength from one father to another. "You do not owe me a thing, Elias," George said. His voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper meant only for the two of them. "You already paid your dues. You paid them in tears, and you paid them in sweat, and you paid them in the quiet hours of the night when the world was asleep, and you were alone with your grief. You survived the unsurvivable. That is all the payment the good Lord requires." George looked deep into Elias's eyes, ensuring that the older man understood the absolute sincerity of his words. "When you go out to that cemetery," George continued, his eyes shining with a shared, unspoken sorrow, "when you lay that beautiful piece of granite down over your boy, I want you to stand tall. I want you to take off your hat, look at the sky, and tell him that his daddy did not give up. Tell him that you fought through the dark, and that you are going to keep on living until it is your time to meet him at the gates. You honor him by breathing, Elias. You honor him by finding a way to smile again. Do you hear me?" Elias nodded, the tears falling freely, his chest shaking with the force of his quiet sobs. "I hear you, sir. I hear you loud and clear." "Good man," George murmured, offering a gentle, reassuring smile. George slowly withdrew his hands from Elias's shoulders. He reached into the small front pocket of his Wrangler jeans. He dug around for a second before pulling out a small, worn object. He took Elias's right hand, turned it palm up, and pressed the object into the center of the calloused skin, folding Elias's fingers over it. Elias opened his hand and looked down. Resting in his palm was a custom heavy-gauge guitar pick. It was black, with George's signature stamped in faded silver lettering across the front. The edges were slightly worn, a testament to the fact that it had actually been used, that it had strummed the chords of the very songs that had saved Elias's life. "You keep that in your pocket," George instructed softly. "Whenever the quiet gets too loud, whenever the weight feels like it is going to pull you under again, you reach down and you hold onto that piece of plastic. You remember that you are not walking this road alone. You remember that there is always a song waiting to pull you back from the edge." Elias clutched the guitar pick tightly in his fist, bringing it to his chest right over his heart. He closed his eyes, letting the profound weight of the gesture wash over his battered soul. "Thank you," he whispered into the quiet air. "Thank you, brother." George gave Elias one last, decisive nod. He turned away from the salesman and looked across the room at Vance. The manager was still standing, frozen by the register, looking like a whipped dog waiting for its master's next command. "Hey," George called out, his voice snapping like a whip through the silent store, instantly causing Vance to flinch. "Yes, Mr. Strait?" Vance squeaked, standing at attention. "I bought 40 pairs of boots, 3 saddles, and about 20 jackets," George stated plainly. "My truck is parked out back in the loading alley. I want every single item boxed up, wrapped in plastic, and loaded into the bed of my pickup. And I want you to do it yourself. Do not ask these kids to help you. Do not ask Elias to lift a finger. You take off that expensive suit jacket, you roll up your sleeves, and you do some actual physical labor for the first time in your life." Vance's eyes widened in horror at the prospect of ruining his tailored clothes and sweating in the humid Texas alleyway. But the terrifying memory of George's threat instantly overrode his vanity. "Yes, sir. I will get started right now, sir. Absolutely. Vance frantically stripped off his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over a velvet display chair, and practically ran toward the back stockroom to begin the grueling process of hauling the heavy merchandise. George watched him go, a faint, satisfied smirk touching the corner of his mouth. He reached down and picked up his silver belly Stetson from the glass counter. He settled it onto his head, adjusting the brim perfectly over his brow, the shadow returning to his eyes, transforming him back into the untouchable legend of the West. He looked at Elias one last time. "Take care of yourself, cowboy," George said, tipping the brim of his hat. "You too, Mr. Strait," Elias replied, his voice finally steady, ringing with a newfound unshakable dignity. "Safe travels." George Strait turned and walked down the center aisle of the Silver Spur Heritage. His boots clicked rhythmically against the Italian marble, a slow, deliberate march of a man who had just restored the balance of the universe in a place that had forgotten its own roots. He reached the heavy glass doors at the front of the boutique. He pushed them open, stepping out of the sterile, artificially cooled, vanilla-scented environment of the luxury store. As the door closed behind him, the brutal, honest, unforgiving heat of the Texas afternoon hit him like a physical wall. The sky above was a brilliant, blinding blue, and the faint smell of hot asphalt and distant rain hung in the air. George took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the real world, and walked away down the sidewalk, blending into the crowd, just another man making his way under the vast southern sky. Time moves forward, healing the wounds that it once tore open. 6 months later, the relentless Texas sun was beating down on the sprawling, quiet green lawns of the county cemetery. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, damp earth, and the sweet, lingering scent of blooming honeysuckle clinging to the wrought iron fences. The wind moved gently through the branches of the ancient oak trees, casting dancing shadows over the rows of silent markers. Elias walked slowly down the narrow gravel path. His posture was entirely different now. The heavy, stooped burden that had defined his physical presence for 3 years was gone. He walked with his shoulders pulled back, his head held high, and a quiet, profound peace radiating from his eyes. The deep lines on his face were still there, but they no longer looked like scars of agony. They looked like the earned markers of a man who had survived a terrible storm and finally found the shore. He was wearing a crisp, clean pearl snap shirt, perfectly pressed denim jeans, and on his feet was a brand new pair of full-quill ostrich boots, polished to a mirror shine. They were the exact same style of boots that George Strait had purchased that fateful day in the boutique. They clicked solidly against the gravel, a steady, confident rhythm. Elias stopped at the end of the row, stepping off the path and onto the soft, manicured grass. He stood before a magnificent, heavy slab of polished black granite. It was flawless, standing tall and proud against the Texas landscape. Deeply engraved into the stone, filled with silver inlay that caught the afternoon sunlight, was the name Thomas Elias Miller. Below the name, the dates of a life cut tragically short, and a simple, powerful inscription, "A beloved son. He rode with the wind." Elias stood before his son's resting place, but for the first time in 3 years, he did not feel the crushing, suffocating urge to fall to his knees and weep into the dirt. He did not feel the freezing darkness of that broken-down truck. He felt the warmth of the sun on his face. He reached out and traced the silver letters of his boy's name with a steady, calloused finger. The stone was warm to the touch, solid and permanent. It was a promise kept. It was a duty fulfilled. "Hey there, Tommy," Elias whispered, his voice carrying clearly on the gentle breeze. His tone was not choked with despair, but filled with a deep, abiding love. "I finally got your stone set up. It looks real good, son. Real strong. Just like you." Elias took a deep breath, looking past the headstone to the rolling hills in the distance. "I miss you every single day, boy. The house is still quiet, but the quiet does not scare me anymore. I'm doing okay. I got a promotion at the store. They got rid of that old manager, brought in a fella who actually knows how to treat people. I am saving up some money again. Thinking about buying a little piece of land out by the river, just like we talked about. Put a small cabin on it. A place for you to come visit me when the wind blows right." Elias smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He reached his right hand into the front pocket of his jeans. His fingers brushed against the familiar, worn edges of the heavy-gauge guitar pick. He pulled it out, holding the black plastic between his thumb and forefinger, the silver signature glinting in the light. "I had some help getting here, Tommy," Elias said softly, looking at the pic. "A good man reminded me that I had to keep walking for you, and I am going to do just that. I am going to live enough for the both of us until it is my turn to come find you." Elias knelt down slowly, the leather of his new boots creaking softly in the quiet cemetery. He placed his hand flat against the warm granite, pressing the guitar pick against the stone, a silent communion between a father, a lost son, and the legendary stranger who had bridged the gap between life and death. He stayed there for a long time, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, listening to the wind moving through the trees. He was a man who had been stripped of everything, pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance, and judged by the superficial standards of a cruel world. But he had been seen. He had been lifted out of the dust by a hand that understood the true value of a soul. The greatest measure of a man is never found in the price tag of his clothes, the balance of his bank account, or the titles he demands from those beneath him. True greatness is a quiet, powerful force. It is the willingness to look past the dirt on a man's boots and see the weight of the invisible cross he carries on his back. It is the courage to step down from a pedestal, stand shoulder to shoulder with the broken, and use whatever strength you have been given to help them carry the load. In a world obsessed with the artificial, the only things that truly endure are the genuine acts of empathy that echo through the darkest nights, reminding the lost that the morning will always come and that they are never truly walking alone. The heavy rain poured hard against the windshield of the broken-down truck. It was the kind of relentless Texas storm that washed away the topsoil and turned the red dirt roads into impassable rivers of mud. Inside the freezing cabin of that old Ford, Elias sat in complete darkness, trembling not from the cold wind howling through the cracked window glass, but from the unbearable weight crushing his chest. The dashboard lights flickered faintly, casting a sickly green glow over his calloused, grease-stained hands. In his right hand, resting heavy and cold against his thigh, was a steel revolver. He had lost his only son just weeks prior in a senseless, tragic accident on a rig out in West Texas. The boy was his entire world, the only family he had left, and the grief had finally hollowed Elias out completely. He had driven out to the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the deafening roar of the thunder, ready to become just another forgotten ghost in the sprawling Texas plains. He closed his eyes, tears mixing with the rain blowing in, and raised the heavy metal. But right at that exact fraction of a second, the rusty radio dial, which had been broken for months, suddenly sparked to life with a burst of static. Through the crackling speakers, a voice drifted into the cold cabin. It was a voice as familiar as the Texas horizon, calm, steady, and carrying a profound, quiet strength. It was George Strait singing, "You Will Be There." The chords filled the cramped space, and the words spoke directly to the shattered pieces of Elias's soul, singing of faith, of seeing loved ones again on the other side, and of holding on through the darkest of nights. The revolver slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the rubber floor mat with a dull thud. Elias collapsed against the steering wheel, sobbing violently as the king of country music sang him back from the edge of the abyss. He survived that night, tethered to life by a song and a promise to honor his boy. 3 years had passed since that storm, but the memory still lived in Elias's bones as he stood under the blinding, sterile halogen lights of the Silver Spur heritage. The contrast between his harsh reality and his current surroundings was a bitter pill to swallow every single morning. The Silver Spur was a high-end Western boutique situated in the most gentrified, affluent district of the city. It was a temple built for the wealthy elite who wanted to play cowboy on the weekends. The air inside smelled of artificial vanilla, expensive cologne, and freshly tanned leather that had never seen a drop of horse sweat or a speck of pasture dust. The floor was made of imported Italian marble, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the $50,000 saddles displayed on velvet pedestals. It was a place where authenticity was manufactured and sold at a premium to men who drove imported sports cars. Elias stood near the back of the showroom, an old rag in his hand, carefully wiping down a row of silver-plated belt buckles. At 52, he looked a decade older. His shoulders were permanently stooped beneath an invisible burden, and his face was lined with the deep crevices of a man who had spent his life working the land before tragedy forced him into the city. He wore a faded plaid shirt, tucked neatly into clean but worn denim, and his boots, though polished, showed the undeniable scuffs of real labor. He hated this job. He hated the suffocating pretension of the store and the way the wealthy customers looked right through him, as if he were part of the rustic decor. But he swallowed his pride every day, enduring the humiliation, because he needed the money. He needed exactly $4,000 to pay off the final balance on a modest granite headstone for his son. Until that stone was paid for and placed over the raw earth of the cemetery, Elias felt he could not rest. The sharp, rapid clicking of expensive dress shoes against the marble floor broke his concentration. Vance, the store manager, was marching down the aisle with the furious energy of a corporate shark. Vance was a man in his early 30s who wore tailored suits, sleek leather loafers, and a permanent sneering expression of superiority. A wireless earpiece was perpetually attached to his ear, connecting him to the regional directors who cared only about profit margins and conversion rates. Vance despised the real country culture. To him, the Western aesthetic was just a highly lucrative demographic to be exploited. He viewed Elias with open disgust, seeing the older man as a walking liability, a relic of a dirty, unrefined world that clashed with the boutique luxury image of the Silver Spur. Vance stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms and glaring at Elias. He did not bother to lower his voice, ensuring that the two junior sales associates near the register could hear every word. "Look at you," Vance hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "I told you to polish those buckles an hour ago, Elias. You move like molasses. And look at your boots. I told you to buy a new pair from the employee catalog. You look like a vagrant who wandered in off the highway. We cater to high-net-worth individuals here, not cattle hands." Elias kept his head down, his grip tightening on the rag. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance, I am moving as fast as I can, and I cannot afford new boots right now. These are clean, sir. I scrubbed them last night." Vance scoffed, a cruel sound that echoed in the quiet store. "I do not care what you can or cannot afford. I care about the aesthetic of my store. If you cannot represent the brand properly, I will find someone who can. You are hanging by a thread here, old man. You have not hit your sales quota in 3 weeks. If you do not close a major ticket today, you can pack up your sad little life and get out. I will not let you drag my numbers down." Before Elias could formulate a response, the heavy glass and brass front door of the boutique chimed softly. Both men turned to look. The man who stepped into the sterile, brightly lit environment immediately shifted the atmosphere of the entire room. The camera of the mind focuses first on his boots. They were incredible, custom-made leather boots, but unlike the pristine merchandise on the shelves, these boots told a story. They were worn, carrying a faint, unmistakable dusting of red Texas dirt in the crevices of the stitching. They moved with a slow, deliberate, and grounded rhythm across the immaculate marble floor. As the man walked further into the store, the scent of the impending evening rain and the faint, honest smell of cedar and sweetgrass seemed to follow him, overpowering the artificial vanilla of the boutique. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with a quiet, unshakable dignity. He wore a crisp, simple pearl snap shirt that fit perfectly, classic Wrangler jeans that stacked just right over his boots, and a silver belly Stetson hat pulled low over his forehead, casting a shadow over his eyes. He did not look around with the frantic, consumerist hunger of the usual clientele. He moved with purpose, yet without any rush, exuding the kind of silent authority that cannot be bought, only earned through decades of living true to oneself. He was looking for a replacement buckle for an old friend, seeking a moment of peace away from the relentless flashbulbs and screaming crowds that usually defined his existence. Vance took one look at the newcomer, and his lip curled in instant dismissal. To the untrained, arrogant eye of the corporate manager, the man was just an aging rancher who had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. Vance saw the dust on the boots, the simplicity of the shirt, and calculated that the man had zero purchasing power. In Vance's world, wealth was loud, draped in designer labels and flashing gold watches. The quiet authenticity of the stranger was entirely lost on him. Vance leaned in close to Elias, his voice a harsh whisper. "Look at that guy. Probably looking for directions or a cheap leather strap, I am not wasting my time on a $0 ticket. I have a client coming in to look at the silver saddles in 10 minutes. You go deal with the old cowboy. And listen to me carefully, Elias. Do not spend an hour talking about the weather. Get him in, get him out, and then go clean the stockroom. If you mess this up, you are done today." Elias nodded silently, swallowing the lump of humiliation in his throat. He carefully set the rag down on the glass counter, smoothed his faded shirt, and began the long walk down the center aisle toward the solitary figure. With every step, Elias felt the exhaustion deep in his bones. The threat of losing his job terrified him. Without this meager paycheck, the headstone would remain unpaid. His son would remain unmarked in the earth. The thought brought a fresh wave of quiet agony to his chest, but he forced a polite professional mask onto his face as he approached the customer. The stranger was standing near a display of handcrafted leather jackets, his back to Elias. He was running a large weathered hand over the tooling of the leather, appreciating the craftsmanship with the touch of a man who actually knew the labor involved in such work. "Excuse me, sir," Elias said, his voice carrying the gentle, respectful drawl of the deep Texas country. "Welcome to Silver Spur. Is there something specific I can help you find this afternoon?" The man paused his inspection of the leather. He turned slowly, the brim of his Stetson rising just enough for the harsh store lights to catch his face. He looked at Elias, and a warm, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Well, I appreciate that, partner," the man murmured. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone, smooth as aged bourbon, and carrying the unmistakable cadence of the Texas plains. "I'm just looking for a solid silver buckle. Nothing too flashy, just something honest for a friend of mine." Elias froze. The air in his lungs vanished. The polite retail smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of absolute stunned reverence. He knew that voice. He knew the shape of those eyes beneath the hat. He knew the quiet, magnetizing presence of the man standing before him. It was the voice that had filled the freezing cabin of his broken-down truck 3 years ago. It was the voice that had reached his soul when he had a gun in his hand. Standing right in front of him, asking about a simple silver buckle, was George Strait. Elias felt his knees grow weak. His mind raced, trying to process the impossibility of the moment. Here, in this plastic, soulless store, the king of country music was standing quietly, unrecognized by the arrogant manager, just looking for a gift for a friend. Elias knew the protocol. He knew he was supposed to maintain absolute professionalism. He knew Vance was watching him like a hawk from across the room, waiting for an excuse to fire him. But looking at the man whose music had literally saved his life, the corporate rules of the Silver Spur heritage dissolved into nothingness. George noticed the sudden stillness in the older salesman. The legend was used to being recognized, and he usually appreciated when fans kept their composure. He saw the shock in Elias's eyes, but he also saw something much deeper. George Strait had spent his entire life looking out at crowds, reading the faces of hard-working people. He possessed a profound empathy, a spiritual intuition honed by his own life experiences and his deep Christian faith. Looking at Elias, George did not just see a starstruck fan. He saw a man carrying a mountain of sorrow. He saw the stooped shoulders, the tired eyes, the trembling hands. George recognized the heavy, suffocating aura of grief because it was a road he had walked himself. "Take your time, friend," George said softly, his voice dropping to a low, comforting register meant only for Elias. "I am in no rush." Elias swallowed hard, fighting the tears that instantly threatened to spill over his weathered cheeks. He took a shaky breath, trying to ground himself. He gestured toward the glass display cases near the back wall. "Yes, sir," Elias managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "We have some fine silver work right this way if you will follow me." George nodded and walked beside Elias. They moved away from the front of the store, deeper into the quiet aisles, away from the piercing gaze of Vance. As they walked, the silence between them was not awkward. It was charged with an unspoken understanding. George moved with the grace of a man perfectly at peace with the world, while Elias vibrated with a nervous, overwhelming energy. They reached the display case. Elias unlocked the glass door with a trembling key. He carefully pulled out a velvet tray lined with handcrafted silver buckles, each one intricately engraved. He placed the tray on the counter, keeping his eyes downcast, terrified that if he looked directly at George again, he would completely break down. "These are forged by a silversmith out of San Angelo," Elias explained, focusing entirely on the merchandise to keep his voice steady. "Solid sterling. Good weight to them. They will last a lifetime, sir." George leaned over the counter, inspecting the pieces. He reached out and picked one up, turning it over in his large hands. "It is good work," George noted, his tone appreciative. "Real solid." As George examined the buckle, Elias stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence stretched. The internal battle within Elias was agonizing. A voice in his head, the voice of survival and fear, screamed at him to stay quiet, to make the sale, to protect his job so he could buy the headstone. But a louder, more desperate voice, the voice of a father who had been saved from the brink of damnation, demanded to be heard. He could not let this man walk out of the store without knowing what he had done. He could not keep the secret of that rainy night inside any longer. "Mr. Strait," Elias whispered. The name hung in the air. George slowly set the silver buckle back down on the velvet tray. He did not look annoyed or surprised. He turned his head, his eyes meeting Elias's, with a calm, steady gaze. "Yes, sir?" George replied gently. Elias gripped the edge of the glass counter so hard his knuckles turned white. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull the words past the massive lump in his throat. The professional facade crumbled entirely, leaving only a raw, vulnerable human being standing before his hero. "I know I'm not supposed to do this," Elias began, his voice shaking violently. "I know I'm just supposed to sell you a buckle and let you go about your day. And I'm so sorry to bother you. But I have to tell you something. I have to." George turned his body completely toward Elias, giving the broken man his full, undivided attention. He did not glance at his watch. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching. He simply stood there, a pillar of quiet strength, and nodded slowly. "You go right ahead and tell me, partner," George said, his voice a soothing balm. "I am listening." The dam broke. The tears that Elias had held back for 3 years flooded his eyes, spilling over his lashes and tracking through the deep wrinkles of his face. He did not bother to wipe them away. "3 years ago," Elias said, his voice dropping to a ragged whisper, "I lost my boy, he was 24, working on a rig out near Odessa. A chain snapped. It was over before he even knew what happened. He was a good boy, Mr. Strait. The best thing I ever did in this world. When they put him in the ground, they buried me right alongside him. I lost my ranch. I lost my wife to the grief. I ended up here in this city, working for a man who treats me like dirt, just trying to survive." George's expression shifted. The polite, relaxed demeanor of the country star melted away, replaced by the profound, sorrowful empathy of a father who knew the exact, agonizing dimensions of that specific pain. George had lost his own daughter years ago. He knew the darkness Elias was speaking of. George's jaw tightened, and he took a half-step closer to Elias, bridging the gap between customer and salesman, becoming simply one grieving father standing with another. "I am so incredibly sorry for your loss," George murmured, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "There is no pain like it in this world." Elias shook his head, the tears falling freely now, spotting the glass counter. "But that is not why I am telling you this," he continued, his voice cracking. 6 months after he passed, I could not take it anymore. The pain was eating me alive. I drove my old truck out to the county line in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. I had my revolver in my hand. I was sitting in the dark, and I put the barrel to my own chest. I was pulling the hammer back. I was ready to go see my boy. George stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Elias, absorbing the heavy, sacred confession. And right then Elias sobbed, his shoulders shaking. The radio sparked on. It had been broken for a year, but it turned on. And it was you. You were singing, "You Will Be There." I sat there in the freezing rain, listening to your voice tell me that I would see him again on the other side, but that I had to wait my turn. I dropped the gun. You saved my life that night, Mr. Strait. You pulled me out of the grave. I'm only standing here today, taking the abuse in this store so I can save up enough money to buy him a proper granite headstone. I just needed to look you in the eye and say thank you. Thank you for keeping me alive. The silence that followed was profound. It was a holy moment in the middle of a temple of greed. George Strait reached out, his large, calloused hand gently grasping Elias's shoulder. The grip was firm, grounding, transmitting a silent message of brotherhood and shared survival. George's own eyes were bright with unshed tears. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer words of comfort to the man who had laid his soul bare. But the sacred moment was violently, brutally shattered. "Well, well, well," a sharp, mocking voice echoed down the aisle. "Is this what I pay you for, Elias? To trap our customers with your pathetic sob stories?" Vance came striding around the corner, his face twisted in an ugly mask of rage and disgust. He had been watching from afar, and seeing Elias crying and talking intimately with the customer had pushed him over the edge. Vance marched right up to the counter, aggressively inserting himself between George and Elias. Vance did not even look at George. He turned his full venomous attention on the older salesman. "I told you to get him in and out. Instead, I find you blubbering over the merchandise, making the clientele uncomfortable. You are a disgrace to this establishment. I am sick of your depressing attitude and your incompetence." Elias shrank back, the vulnerability of his confession instantly weaponized against him. He wiped his face frantically with the back of his hand, his eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Vance, please, I do not care what you were doing," Vance shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You are done, you hear me? You are fired. Go to the back, take off that vest and get out of my store. You will not see a dime of severance. Pack your trash and leave." Elias's world collapsed. The headstone, the money, his survival. It was all gone in an instant. He looked at Vance, his face pale, his spirit completely crushed under the heel of the arrogant manager. "Yes, sir," Elias whispered, utterly defeated. He turned away, his shoulders slumped lower than ever, preparing to walk to the back room and into the abyss of unemployment. But before Elias could take a second step, a voice cut through the air. It was not loud, it did not need to be. It was a voice that possessed the weight of a falling mountain, calm, deep, and vibrating with a terrifying, controlled fury. "Hold on just a minute, son." Vance stopped. He turned around, an annoyed retort ready on his lips, prepared to dismiss the old cowboy. George Strait stepped forward. He reached up and slowly, deliberately took off his Stetson hat, holding it by his side. The harsh boutique lights illuminated his face completely. The legendary features, the piercing eyes, the stoic jawline. He was no longer an anonymous customer in the shadows. He was the king of country music, and he was staring directly at Vance with a look of absolute, freezing judgment. Vance's annoyed expression faltered. He blinked. His eyes widened as his brain finally processed the face of the man standing in front of him. The arrogant sneer melted off his face, replaced instantly by the pale, clammy sheen of pure panic. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, exactly who he had just interrupted and exactly who he had just disrespected. The silence that descended upon the pristine, brightly lit showroom of the Silver Spur heritage was so absolute, so heavy, that it felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the room. The soft, artificial hum of the high-end air conditioning system suddenly sounded like a roaring engine in the background. Vance, the immaculately dressed, ruthlessly ambitious manager, stood frozen on the imported Italian marble floor. The color drained from his face with the rapid, sickening speed of a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the impact. His perfectly styled hair and his expensive, tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap, ridiculous costume in the presence of the man standing before him. George Strait did not move. He stood with the grounded, immovable posture of a centuries-old Texas oak tree that had weathered 1,000 storms. He held his silver-belly Stetson by his side, his large, calloused hands resting easily against the brim. His face, usually a canvas of calm, stoic warmth, was now set in lines of cold, undeniable authority. His eyes, sharp and clear, locked onto Vance, stripping away the younger man's corporate arrogance layer by agonizing layer. George did not need to shout. He did not need to puff out his chest. True power, the kind forged in the fires of real life, real loss, and genuine hard work, never needs to raise its voice. "Mr. Strait," Vance choked out, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the venomous bark he had used on Elias just seconds prior. The wireless earpiece blinked uselessly against his pale skin. A bead of cold sweat broke out on his forehead, catching the glare of the halogen lights. Sir, I had absolutely no idea it was you, I swear. If I had known... George tilted his head infinitesimally, a gesture so slight, yet so loaded with quiet judgment, that Vance physically flinched. If you had known what, son? George asked, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that resonated through the quiet store, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. If you had known I sell records for a living, you would have treated me differently. You would have put on a plastic smile and offered me a cup of coffee, while you continued to treat this man like the dirt on the bottom of your shoe. Vance swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically against the tight collar of his designer shirt. His hands fluttered nervously, suddenly unsure of what to do with themselves. No, sir. No, that is not what I meant at all. It is an absolute honor to have you in my store. We are huge fans. I was trying to maintain a standard of excellence here. This employee, Elias, he was bothering you with his personal issues. We have a strict policy against harassing the VIP clientele. I was only trying to protect your privacy, Mr. Strait. Please allow me to take over from here. Let me show you to the VIP lounge in the back. I will personally handle your purchases today. Everything is on the house, of course. The sycophantic, desperate backpedaling was pathetic to witness. Vance stepped forward, reaching out a manicured hand as if to physically usher the king of country music away from the broken, weeping salesman still standing by the glass counter. George did not take the offered hand. He did not even look at it. He kept his piercing gaze fixed directly on Vance's eyes, holding the younger man captive in a stare that felt like a physical weight. "You do not know the first thing about excellence," George said softly, the quiet volume of his voice making the words hit with the force of a sledgehammer. "You sell boots that have never stepped in the mud. You sell saddles that have never felt the heat of a horse. You sell a lifestyle that you do not respect to people who only want to wear it like a costume. But the real fabric of this life, the real heart of the country you are trying to package and sell, is standing right behind me." George slowly turned his body, his broad shoulders shielding Elias from Vance's predatory gaze. Elias was still trembling, his hands gripping the edge of the glass display case as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. The tears were still wet on his deeply lined face, his chest heaving with the suppressed sobs of a father who had just been forced to relive his greatest trauma, only to be punished for it. Elias looked completely shattered, a man who had been pushed to the very edge of his endurance and was finally collapsing under the weight of a world that refused to show him an ounce of mercy. George looked at Elias, and the cold, unyielding judgment in his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a wellspring of profound, aching compassion. It was the look of a man who had also received that midnight phone call, who had also felt the earth open up and swallow his entire universe, who had also stood over a grave and wondered how the sun could ever dare to rise again. "Elias," George said, his tone shifting completely, becoming as gentle and steady as a calm river. "Put your vest back on. You are not going anywhere."